So this is going to be kind of an experiment. I've never done a podcast where I'm going to be, how do I start this? This is going to be a different type of show. Actually, it's not really a show. It's just me reading books that I like. And hopefully, some of the stuff will be interesting to my kids later on in life. But yeah, I thought it would be good for me to kind of document things that I'm thinking about, things that are important to me. And so the first book that I want to go through is called Falling Upward. It's by Richard Rohr. And I read this book, I want to say about 4 years ago. And it's been one of those books that's been a constant companion for me. I've had it next to my bed and have read through certain chapters over and over again. This is one of those books where you want to have a pen handy, a highlighter, just to underline things that speak to you. This book has spoken to me in so many different moments in my life, and I've carried this book in my backpack for a long time, and it's just been a treasure. This has been just such a great book. I wish I discovered this earlier in life, but as we go through this, you might see that some of the concepts I probably wouldn't really grasp earlier in life. It probably wouldn't mean that much because the things he speaks about I probably wouldn't be ready for, but I still wish I would have read it earlier in life. It would have been a helpful guide to know kind of some of the things I would be dealing with later on. Anyways, I was thinking about where to start with this book, and I just read through the introduction again, which is fantastic. So I think I'll start there, and we'll just go through it together, and I'm going to basically read to you some of the things that really stand out to me, and we'll talk about it, and I'll share with you my questions. I don't understand everything, so there's going to be some things that I read where you'll see that I don't really know what to say, but I'll just be thinking about it. So anyways, let's get started. I'm on the introduction, and he starts off with two quotes. One by Carl Jung. I think that's the way you say it. The quote is, what is a normal goal to a young person becomes a neurotic hindrance in old age. And then the second quote is from a Native American aphorism that says, no wise person ever wanted to be younger. So those are really a really great way to kind of begin this book. You can kind of already see kind of the setting, that this is something about the second half of life, which he's going to get into. Now, what Richard Rohr gets into a little bit later too is that this doesn't necessarily mean age. Doesn't mean you need to be older to appreciate what he calls the second half of life. And I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just get into this book and we'll talk through it. Okay. So Richard begins. There is much evidence on several levels that there are at least two major tasks to human life. The first task is to build a strong container or identity. The second is to find the contents that the container was meant to hold. Now, Richard uses a lot of metaphor, and sometimes I get it right away. Many times I have to think about it. But here he's talking about kind of the structure, I guess, of the first half of life and the second half of life. Okay, I just had to grab another book. So Richard has another book called The Immortal Diamond. And on page, at least for the book I have, page 190 and 191, he breaks out in a really cool diagram the first half of life and the second half of life and what they mean. So the first half of life is what Richard also calls the false self. And this is the container, the identity that we think we are. This is I guess one way to think about it is these are the temporal things about ourselves. This is the self that Richard says changes and dies off. This is maybe what we say is our profession. Oh, I'm doing such a terrible job of explaining this. And what's really funny is that I read this book so many times. I want to say 100 times I've read through some of these chapters, and I'm like doing a terrible job of trying to explain the first half of life. I think the best way I would put it right now, and we'll get into it more because Richard does a really good job of explaining this. It's like the temporal version of you. Those things that change throughout your life, oftentimes. So, like for example, for me, earlier in life, I was a student, and then I got a job, and then I got into a career path. And sometimes if people ask me, "Oh, tell me about yourself," I would go right to, "Oh, this is my career. This is who I am," right? But that's not really who I am. But for some reason, earlier in life, we sometimes put our identity into those temporal things that we are in that moment. So it's like right now, I could say that I am a dad, I am a husband, I work in a certain career field. Like those are all true things, but it's not really who I am. And we get into trouble when we start to identify ourselves with those kind of temporal things, those things that are part of our identity that's passing, but that's not truly who we are, right? You'll notice also that there's a lot of metaphor here, because I think metaphor sometimes does a better job of explaining things. And you'll also notice there's a lot of spiritual language, and that can, for some people, upset people, or for some people think whenever you hear spiritual language that it's meaningless. Please stay with me. I think you'll appreciate some of the metaphors and the spiritual language. I love it. So anyways, let's get back to it. Richard says, the first task of life we take for granted as the very purpose of life, which does not mean we do it well. The second task, I am told, is more encountered than sought. Few arrive at it with much pre-planning, purpose, or passion. So you might wonder if there's much point in providing a guide to the territory ahead of time. Yet that is exactly why we must. It is vitally important to know what is coming and being offered to all of us. How about that for an intro? What a great way to kick this off. Like, he's teasing this out. Like, for some of us who have not entered into the second half of life or don't know what that is, like, I think when I first read this, I was super excited because I was like, oh, what does this second half of life mean? Like, what's he getting at? Is this even real? And so I was really excited about when I first started reading this about, first half of life, second half of life. Never really heard of things like that before. I never read Carl Jung or Jung. So I didn't really know what to do with it, but I was very intrigued about looking at life through a first half, second half of life. And my initial thought was, this must mean chronology. Like, there's a certain point in your chronology of your life, maybe it's age 30, 40, where you kind of transition into this second half. Richard gets into that and says that's not exactly how it works. Anyways, let's get back to it. Richard continues. He says, we are a first half of life culture, largely concerned about surviving successfully. I want to stop there. Like, isn't that true? Like, so much, and this is the way I feel, like so much of us, like the way we're raised is, how can we grow up to be a successful person in whatever field that is? That could be being a great parent, which is a noble pursuit. We should all be doing that. Being a great worker, a great business owner, you fill in the blank, right? A great husband, a great wife, a great son. Like, Richard says, we are a first half of life culture, largely concerned about essentially being successful in whatever it is that we identify with. And that's not bad. And Richard's not saying there's anything bad with that. In fact, that's what we should be doing. We should all be striving to be successful in those things, whatever it is that we are drawn to, or wherever place we are in life. Like, we should definitely be striving to be successful in those things, whatever success means to you. Richard goes on. He says, probably most cultures and individuals across history have been situated in the first half of their own development up to now, because it is all they had time for. We all try to do what seems like the task that life first hands us. And now he's going to get into first half of life tasks. Here they are. Now I'm going to read them and then we'll talk a little bit about them. So the first half of life tasks include establishing an identity, a home, relationships, friends, community, security, and building a proper platform for our only life. And you'll notice that a lot of those words, those tasks, can be very temporal in nature, right? Our friends can change throughout our life. Our community, or what we consider to be our community, can change depending on our interests, right? So he's just mentioning these different tasks that happen in life that are necessary and all good, but they change, they evolve. And that's kind of the idea behind the first half. These are all kind of temporal things that evolve over time, and they don't define us. They're just who we were part of during a certain season. Richard goes on, he says, but it takes us much longer to discover the task within the task, as I like to call it, what we are really doing when we are doing what we are doing. I had to underline that one. And this is where we get into metaphor. But essentially here that he says that the task in the first half that he just named, relationships, friendships, our community, who we think we are, our career, like all those things, like that's all kind of temporal first half of life tasks. And he says basically that it takes us much longer to discover the task within the task, like who we truly are meant to be. What Richard says later on, the true self. And he has a whole book about it called The Immortal Diamond, like who you truly are, who you are meant to be. Like instead of a career, it could be like, what is your calling, right? That is like much deeper, right? And for many of us, we don't discover that until later in life. And it just takes us longer to kind of get to that point. Richard continues, he says, two people can have the same job description, and one is holding a subtle or not so subtle life energy in doing his or her job, while another is holding a subtle or not so subtle negative energy while doing the exact same job. Most of us are somewhere in between, I suppose. And I think we all know examples of this. You know, some people who, like, in their, whatever their work is, being a father, being a mother, working in a certain task in a career, like some people can be super effective, they're very passionate about it, they love doing it, and other people could be just doing the job because it's required and have no love or passion for it. And for certain things, like, it may not matter, but Richard is just saying, like, two people can have the same job description, and some people have a positive energy about it, some people have a negative energy about it, and some are kind of in between, right? And then Richard says, we actually respond to one another's energy more than to people's exact words or actions. Again, I had to underline that. I thought that was a really interesting thought. We respond to other people's energy, like what they're bringing to it. And I think along with that goes like the personality, the vibrance, what is it? It's not a tangible thing you can point to. It's an emotional response. Richard says that we ought to respond more to another's energy more than their exact words or actions. I thought that was interesting, right? Like, I definitely, when he said like exact words, like, yeah, because words don't mean much. Like, it comes down to the action. Do people actually model that behavior? Do they actually care? Are they passionate about it? Like, I guess that's what Richard's getting at, is like the passion, the energy. Like, that's what is going to actually help you model that behavior and show that you're true to that thing, whatever it is that you're saying or doing. Like, yeah, I guess it is. I guess it is that energy level that we can respond to, I guess, more easily and see that it's actually real. Right. But I guess I always looked at action as being the marker, right? If you're actually doing that thing and you're modeling the behavior, that means that you actually are truthful. You actually believe in that thing. But yeah, it's interesting that he gets to that too. It's not even the action, he says. It's really the energy level you're bringing to it. So interesting. I like it. Richard says, he goes on, he says, in any situation, your taking or giving of energy is what you're actually doing. Period. Okay, so that was another good one. I mean, so we're either taking energy from somebody, something, or giving energy. Isn't that interesting? I think that's an interesting way of looking at things. I never really, it's funny because I've read this a dozen times. I don't remember reading that. I'm not taking or giving of energy, because sometimes I feel like in life we're not doing either. We're just being very passive. But maybe by being passive, we are taking away energy from somebody. We could be draining on somebody because we're not at their level of energy or not giving back energy. I don't know. I like that though. Richard goes on, he says, everybody can feel, suffer, or enjoy the difference, but few can exactly say what it is that is happening. Why do I feel drawn or repelled? What we all desire and need from one another, of course, is that life energy called eros. It always draws, creates, and connects things. I like that. I like that. That life energy, that eros, that, I want to say passion. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's what's coming to my mind. This like vibrance, this passion. Like, that's like when you see people in their work, whatever that is, and they're just super passionate about it, like they love it. Like, man, that can draw you in, that can connect you. Like that excites me. Like, for example, this book, I'm totally drawn to this book. It excites me. I'm very obviously passionate enough about it to record me reading it. No matter how boring that sounds, I apologize. But yeah, it's that eros, that life energy. And then Richard goes on, he says, this is surely what Jesus meant when he said that you could only tell a good tree from a bad one by its fruits. Inside of life energy, a group or family will be productive and energetic. Inside of a death energy, there will be gossip, cynicism, and mistrust hiding behind every interaction. Yet, you usually cannot precisely put your finger on what is happening. That is second half of life wisdom, or what Paul calls the discerning of spirits. So interesting that he uses those references from Jesus and Paul, particularly the one about Jesus, how we can determine what Jesus, the metaphor about the good tree from the bad one by its fruits. And again, when I think about that metaphor, I think about, well, this is by people's actions, right? you can say all the nice things you want. You can, and there's the examples of the preachers who are saying really important things from the pulpit, but yet they then live a life totally contrary to what they've just said. And I think about it as being a dad, like how important it is for me when I'm telling my kids how to live, how to behave, that I'm modeling that behavior, right? Because there's that saying about actions speak louder than words. And so if I'm telling my kids all the right things, telling them how to live, telling them how to care for one another, but I'm not modeling that, like, it's really meaningless. I'm not actually living that out. So I'm not really telling the kids that this is actually true, that I actually believe it, because I'm not actually following it, right? And so I think this is part of what Richard Rohr is talking about the good tree from the bad one. You can tell by its fruits, right? It's very easy to become a bad tree. You stop modeling good behavior. You can kind of easily go between. I think in life we can sometimes go between the good tree and the bad tree, depending on the situation and how we respond. Richard goes on and says, integrity largely has to do with purifying our intentions and a growing honesty about our actual motives. It is hard work. Most often we don't pay attention to that inner task until we've had some kind of fall or failure in our outer tasks. This pattern is invariably true for reasons I have yet to fathom. Life, if we are honest about it, is made up of many failings and fallings. Amidst all of our hopeful growing and achieving, those failings and fallings must be there for a purpose that neither culture nor church has fully understood. Most of us find all failure bewildering, but it does not have to be. Period. Okay, let's stop there. Man, if you saw my book, you would see underlines and stars next to that section. And if that speaks to you, you're in for a treat, because Richard gets into the falling a lot in this book. And that's actually the stuff that speaks to me, because I think about my own trials, my own fallings, my future fallings that I'm going to be having. Man, that is hard, right? And Richard says that this is the beautiful part here. In that line, he says, most often we don't pay attention to that inner task until we've had some kind of fall or failure in our outer tasks. Like that hits deep. I don't know about you, but that hits me deep. And isn't it strange that it comes from the fall? It comes from our own mistakes, and sometimes deep, hard mistakes we've made, where we actually learn the most about ourselves and who we are. That speaks to me. And I think this is part of one of the reasons why I love this book so much, is because going through failure, really hard mistakes in life, those are the moments that can break us down. It can cause us to rethink who we are, and we can either grow from those experiences and become better people, or you can become cynical. You can dwell in that failure and stay there. There's lots of different ways we can respond to it. I hope that all of us would grow from those mistakes and become better people, more loving, more compassionate, more caring, more empathy for those who make similar mistakes, or whatever mistakes they're making. Like, I hope empathy is grown there. But anyways, so that's kind of just a highlight. That's a teaser for what's coming up ahead. If that speaks to you, it speaks to me. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so let me skip down a little bit. He says, maybe we should just call this book Tips for the Road, a sort of roadside assistance program. Or perhaps it's like a medical brochure that describes the possible symptoms of a future heart attack. Oh man, that is so right. That is such a great description. And this is why I was saying like this book would have been really helpful for me earlier in life. Although I don't think I would have understood that all this talk about future mistake, future fallings. My idea of it would probably be like, oh, small mistakes, um, small failings. Um, no, but as life moves on and as really tragic things happen, like man, I wish I was better prepared. And maybe we'll get into that later on. Um, I might get into that myself on this show, but yeah. But I like this tips for the road, like what's coming out. So he says, I like this. He says, perhaps it's like a medical brochure that describes the possible symptoms of a future heart attack. Reading it when you might feel like a waste of time, but it could make the difference between life and death if a heart attack actually happens. He says, my assumption is that the second half of your own life will happen, although I hope it is not a heart attack, unless you understand heart attack symbolically, of course. So much metaphor here. I love that. The idea of a heart attack. An actual, not talking about physical heart attack, but actually like, man, at your heart's core, when you are tragically taken down, either by a personal failing, by some trauma that has happened to you, some failure, some sort of falling, something that is so hard that you could be going through right now, could be coming up. And guess what? These types of things come up. And this book to me has been preparation for future fallings, to remember who I am and how I need to be responding. But yeah, I love this tips for the road, a sort of roadside assistance program. I think that's a great way of putting it. Okay, now Richard goes on. He says, and this is where he gets into the chronology. He says, when I say that you will enter the second half of life, I don't mean it in a strictly chronological way. Some young people, especially those who have learned from early suffering, are already there. And some older folks are still quite childish. If you're still in the first half of your own life chronologically or spiritually, I would hope that this book will offer you some good guidance, some warnings, limits, permissions, and lots of possibilities. If you're in the second half of life already, I hope this book will at least assure you that you're not crazy and also give you some hearty bread for your whole journey. Period. Oh, isn't that beautiful? I love that. And like I said, I think that if I had read this earlier in life, I probably wouldn't get a lot of it. It wouldn't be that meaningful. But since I have endured some hard times, it speaks to me on a whole nother level. And I do wish that I had a little more preparation for things that were coming up, because this book is definitely a beautiful guide for that. Okay, let's move on. He says, most of us are never told that we can set out from the known and the familiar to take on a further journey. Our institutions and our expectations, including our churches, are almost entirely configured to encourage, support, reward, and validate the tasks of the first half of life. Shocking and disappointing, but I think it's true. We are more struggling to survive than to thrive. More just getting through or trying to get to the top than finding out what is really at the top or was already at the bottom. Period. Again, a lot of metaphor here, but the idea is that a lot of our institutions, a lot of the things that we're taught growing up, is really there to help support that first half of life structure. And I think part of that is necessary. Like, how do we become a better parent? How do we become a good employee in our work? Our schools are training us to help us get into a career field. Like, those are all necessary things. But as Richard points out, like, that's not all of it. Like, we also need to be told and prepared for what else is coming up, and also who we truly are, and how do we get on that path to discover who we truly are. And then also, like we just said, like, be prepared for those trials, for those very hard times, and being aware that those times are coming and they'll continue to come. And really, like, basically the idea here is like churches, institutions, especially those spiritual organizations really need to be pressing in on those areas, and probably more so than they are the first task of life. Moving on, Richard says, Thomas Merton, the American monk, pointed out that we may spend our whole life climbing the ladder of success, only to find, when we get to the top of that ladder, it's leaning against the wrong wall. Period. Oh, man. Now, Richard introduced me to Thomas Merton from this book, and I've just started reading in the last year New Seeds of Contemplation by Thomas Merton, which is another fantastic book that I'll probably want to read through as well in the future, because it is so rich. I'll probably have a lot of hard time reading through Merton, because it's there's a lot of metaphor. It is not meant to be read quickly. I understand, like, I don't know, 2% of what he's saying, but what I do understand, I'm just like, it sits with me. Kind of like Richard Rohr, it just stays with me. But I feel that Richard Rohr is much more accessible. Like, I get it. Richard, like, helps bring these things to life, these concepts to life. And with Merton, it just takes me more time, and it's time well spent. But yeah, I think I'll definitely want to read some Merton. But yeah, I want to get back to that Merton quote about, we may spend our whole life climbing the ladder of success, only to find when we get to the top that our ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. And that can speak to us on so many levels, right? I know that sometimes we go to school for a certain career field. We then get into that career field, and then sometimes 10 years, 20 years down the line, we realize this was not at all what I should have been doing. I should have been doing X, right? I should have been doing something else, not this. Or we do all these things that we think we should be doing to build up a, quote, successful life. And then we finally achieve those things, or we achieve some of those things, and we realize that those things didn't bring us the happiness we thought, right? Same could be true of spirituality. We do all those things that we think are going to make us a, quote, spiritual person or better person. And the more work you try, the more you try at that thing, you realize that, oh man, I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to be successful at that. So I think that that's a very interesting, I love that quote. And man, so this book, I think, is part of being the guide to help us get on the right path, to make sure we're on the right ladder. I like that metaphor, that are we on the right ladder? Are we going up in the right direction? And maybe it's not even up. Maybe it's more sideways. But are we going in the right direction? That's really the point, I think, here. But you're only going to know if you can, I guess, tap into your true self, like who you truly are, what you're truly called for. And those are good questions that we should be asking ourselves. Who are we? What is it that we actually want? And what are we called to do? Like what brings us meaning at the deepest level? Like those are hard questions to ask, hard, deep questions to think about. And I think also questions that we should regularly ask ourselves, because our answers can change over time about what brings us meaning in this moment. And I'm aware of what I'm saying here about oh, well, isn't that a temporal thing now? I think what I mean is like your deeper meaning is going to be the true self. Like, but how that deeper meaning is played out right now can change, right? So for me, for example, I think one of my deeper meanings is how can I love and energize those that I care for, right? Like that at the core of me, like how do I empower, how do I love those that I care for? So I hope I think that's my true self. I would hope that's my true self. But how that's played out right now, temporally, is like how am I then doing this as a husband? How am I doing this as a dad? How am I doing this as a leader at work? Like how am I caring, loving, energizing those who I'm in contact with? How am I doing this as a son, right? Like that's a little bit into my world. This is how I'm kind of thinking about all this. Anyways, let's move on. Richard says, most of us in the first half of life suspect that all is not fully working, and we are probably right. It was not meant to stand alone. We were just told to build a nice basement and some kind of foundation for our house, but not given any plans or even a hint that we would also need to build an actual living room upstairs, let alone a nutritious kitchen. So many, if not most of us, settle for the brick and mortar of first stage survival and never get to that what I'll be calling the unified field or life itself. As Bill Plotkin, a wise guide, puts it, many of us learn to do our survival dance, but we never get to our actual sacred dance. Period. Isn't that beautiful? And man, when I first read that, I was like, man, that's so true that I think it's so easy for us to get caught up in the moment. And by the way, just trying to survive, just trying to get through some of our weeks. And I mean, right now during COVID-19, just to get through a day, sometimes an hour, without being so worried about the future, anxious. So often, like we get caught up in that what Bill's saying, that survival dance. That he says, like we never actually get to the sacred dance, like what we truly need to be doing. And I love those metaphors. As you can see in this book, it's packed with metaphor. And so the thing with metaphor is it just causes us to dig deeper, to think about like what does that mean for me at a deeper level. Okay, now we get into a really cool section in the introduction. And Richard subtitled it The Way Up and the Way Down. Let's get to this. This is good. He says, the soul has many secrets. They are only revealed to those who want them and are never completely forced upon us. One of the best kept secrets, and yet one hidden in plain sight, is that the way up is the way down. Or if you prefer, the way down is the way up. Period. Okay. Again, a lot of metaphor and a lot of spiritual language too about the soul. And so that could turn off a lot of people if you're not into that kind of thing. But if you don't want to say soul, maybe like think about your being, right? Who you are. He says, okay, in some of these metaphors, we just have to I don't get it sometimes until I keep reading. So he says, okay, the way up is the way down, or the way down is the way up. You're reading that going, huh? What? What does that mean? Okay. Let's keep reading because he's going to get into it. He says, the pattern is obvious in all of nature. From the very change of seasons, right? You think about those different seasons, the spring, growth, and then fall, right? And then winter time where things die. He says, this pattern is obvious in all of nature, from the very change of seasons and substances on the earth to the 600 million tons of hydrogen that the sun burns every day to light and warm our earth, even to the metabolic laws of dieting or fasting. The down-up pattern is constant too in mythology, in stories like that of Persephone, who must descend into the underworld and marry Hades for spring to be reborn. In legends and nature, sacrifice of something to achieve something else is almost always the pattern. Dr. Faust has to sell his soul to the devil to achieve power and knowledge. Sleeping Beauty must sleep for 100 years before she can receive the princess's kiss. In scripture, we see that the wrestling and wounding of Jacob are necessary for Jacob to become Israel, and the death and resurrection of Jesus are necessary to create Christianity. Richard says the loss and renewal pattern is so constant and ubiquitous that it should hardly be called a secret at all. Period. Isn't it interesting? Like, I mean, what he just said is kind of like this, like, life, death, kind of this life and death cycle. I mean, we see it in the seasons, we see it in life. He's just pointing this out. And I know you're listening to this going like, well, yeah, that's not really a secret. Like, okay, let's get more into it. Richard says, yet it is still a secret, probably because we do not want to see it. We do not want to embark on a further journey if it feels like going down, especially after we have put so much sound and fury into going up. Period. Okay, so now he's going to begin to talk about how this like cycle of the life, death, kind of rebirth, death, kind of this cycle of like growth, falling, growth, falling, growth, falling. Like now he's applying it to life, like our lives. And he's saying that we don't really want to see it. Like, and it's true, like we don't really want to be thinking about the fallings, the death. We want to focus on the life, right? But Richard says we do not want to embark on a further journey if it feels like going down. Like, who wants to go down? Who wants to fail? Richard continues, this is surely the first and primary reason why many people never get to the fullness of their own lives. The supposed achievements of the first half of life have to fall apart and show themselves to be wanting in some way, or we will not move further. Why would we? Normally, a job, fortune, or a reputation has to be lost. A death has to be suffered. A house has to be flooded, or a disease has to be endured. The pattern, in fact, is so clear that one has to work rather hard or be intellectually lazy to miss the continual lesson. This, of course, was Scott Peck's major insight in his best-selling book, The Road Less Traveled. He told me personally once that he felt most Western people were just spiritually lazy. And when we are lazy, we stay on the path we are already on, even if it's going nowhere, period. Again, this is the idea that Merton talked about going up the wrong ladder. Okay, let's move on. Richard says, some kind of falling, what I will soon call necessary suffering, is programmed into the journey. All the sources seem to say it, starting with Adam and Eve and all they represent. Yes, they sinned and were cast out of the Garden of Eden, but from those very same acts came consciousness, conscience, and their own further journey. But it all started with transgression. Only people unfamiliar with sacred story are surprised that they ate the apple. As soon as God told them specifically not to, you know they will. It creates the whole storyline inside of them. It creates the whole storyline inside of which we can find ourselves. Richard says, it is not that suffering or failure might happen, or that it will only happen to you if you are bad, which is what religious people often think, or that it will happen to unfortunate or to the few in other places, or that you can somehow by cleverness or righteousness avoid it. No, it will happen, and to you, losing, failing, falling, sin, and the suffering that comes from those experiences. All of this is a necessary and even good part of the human journey. Okay, I gotta tell you that paragraph, I underlined, I started. In fact, I gotta read it again because, and not all of it's nice to read, especially when it talks about this being necessary and even a good part of the human journey. I was like, what? Richard, how can you call this a good part? This is a devastating, tragic part of the human journey. He means it in the sense of, like, this is, from this springs growth for us if we want it. Okay, I got to read this again because this is such a powerful paragraph that, again, this is one of those paragraphs that I wish I had read earlier in life because it speaks so much to me right now. And I definitely fell into the trap of thinking that I was somehow exempt from true suffering. I felt, being raised in a evangelical Christian home in Orange County, California, I felt that, oh, well, if I just do X, Y, and Z and I'm a good person, then God should be blessing me and excluding me from certain tragic things. That was my privileged childish thinking early in life. And so when trauma did happen, I was just shaken to the core, didn't understand how that was possible. So anyways, let me read this again because this is something that I had to meditate on and think about a lot. Okay. This paragraph, man, it's gold. It's meat. It's meaty. It's a steak. Okay, let's dig in again. It is not that suffering or failure might happen, or that it will only happen to you if you are bad, which is what religious people often think. Yes, totally. That was me. Or that it will happen to the unfortunate, or to a few in other places, or that you can somehow, by cleverness or righteousness, avoid it. No, it will happen, and to you. Losing, failing, falling, sin, and the suffering that comes from those experiences, all of this is a necessary and even good part of the human journey, period. Okay, so whatever you want to call it. Richard uses the words losing, failing, falling, sin. Some of those words might not mean anything to you. Whatever you want to call that suffering, that pain, that trauma, whatever word you want to put there, like that horrific event, that death, whatever it is, that disease, you fill in the blank, like it's coming, it's part of life. Like Richard just said, like you look at the seasons, you look at how life operates, these cycles, and like we all know it, like intuitively we know it, we just don't want to think about it. And Richard's like, hey, you know what? Part of being a good guide is like letting you know, like, hey, when we enter into this territory, there's going to be ravines, there's going to be rivers, there's going to be treacherous climbs on this mountain, there's going to be valleys, there's going to be parts where we have no water. Like a good guide is going to tell you all that up front and to help prepare you. And we don't really want to think about it. I mean, who wants to talk about those horrific traumas that we go through in life? And I think the thing that bothered me in this paragraph was when he said a necessary and even good part of the human journey. Like that bothered me. I'm like, what do you mean good part? That's like the most tragic, traumatic parts of our journey that no one wants to even think about. But again, Richard is talking about in the sense of where growth can happen for us. And I know that is, depending on the trauma you're thinking about, you might be thinking, nope, I don't agree with that statement at all. I get you. I totally feel you. But I think, from reading a lot of Richard, he's definitely not talking about it being a good thing in the sense of, obviously it's traumatic. He's not talking about that. He's talking about like from the spiritual growth and entering into the new territory of understanding ourselves better. Like that's like an amazing thing for us. Yeah, it's a hard thing to read. But I think I understand a little bit of what Richard's saying right there. Richard goes on, he says, you cannot avoid sin or mistake it away, but if you try too fervently, it often creates even worse problems. Jesus tells a story like those of the publican and the Pharisee in Luke 18, and the famous one about the prodigal son in Luke 15, in which one character does his life totally right and is in fact wrong, and the other who does it totally wrong and ends up God's beloved. Right? We're all familiar with the prodigal son, and like the son, the story there is he goes off, right, and does these sinful things. He's selfish, prideful, arrogant, greedy, ends up coming back and welcomed back in open arms, right? And then you have the good son who was always faithful. He stayed, he never left, and was bitter, right? And didn't understand how the father could take the son back, right? And that's the idea here is like, here you had this guy who did it all right, right? The good son. He didn't do anything wrong. He was like faithful, and he stayed with the father, and he was shocked that the brother left, right? But then, like, man, you found out at the end that he was bitter and angry, wouldn't even go to the party that the father had sent. And this is the kind of the idea of that parable. Like, interesting, right? Like, he does it all wrong. The prodigal son does everything wrong, but it's like welcomed back from the falling. He's welcomed back and loved. And then you have the guy who did everything right, but at the end had the wrong attitude, was bitter, and his true colors kind of shone in that moment. Richard goes on, he says, these two groups have very different plans for themselves. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead too far. Richard says, okay, so the prodigal son story. Now deal with that. Jesus also tells us that there are two groups who are very good at trying to deny or avoid the humiliating surprise, those who are very rich and those who are very religious. These two groups have very different plans for themselves as they try to totally steer their own ships and well-chosen itineraries. They follow two different ways of going up and avoiding all down. Such a down and then up perspective does not fit into our Western philosophy of progress, nor into our desire for upward mobility, nor into our religious notions of perfection or holiness. Okay, let's move on. Richard continues talking about this falling. He says, today, we might use a variety of metaphors. Reversing engines, a change in game plan, falling off the very wagon that we constructed. No one would choose such upheaval consciously. We must somehow fall into it. Those who are too carefully engineering their own superiority systems will usually not allow it at all. It is much more done to you than anything you do yourself. Right? A lot of these events sometimes happen to us. These traumas. It's not something that we have planned for ourselves generally. And he says, and sometimes non-religious people are more open to this change in a strategy than are religious folks who have their private salvation project all worked out. This is how I would interpret Jesus' enigmatic words. The children of this world are wiser in their ways than the children of light. Rohr says, in this book, I would like to describe how this message of falling down and moving up is in fact the most counterintuitive message in most of the world's religions, including and most especially Christianity. We grow spiritually much more by doing it wrong than by doing it right. That might just be the central message of how spiritual growth happens, yet nothing in us wants to believe it. I actually think it is the most workable meaning of any remaining notion of original sin. There seems to have been a fly in the ointment from the beginning. But the key is recognizing and dealing with the fly rather than needing to throw out the whole ointment. Okay, I got to stop there. That right there is gold, right? And I underlined that because I had to really think about like what Rohr was saying there about we grow spiritually much more by doing it wrong than doing it right. Like that, when I first read that, I was like, that doesn't make really any sense. Like how can we grow spiritually? How do we become a better person? How do we grow in empathy and whatever it is that makes you a better person, makes me a better person? How does that happen in the midst of failure and falling? And this is really what this whole book is about. I mean, the book is called Falling Upward, right? This idea that we all can grow in fantastic, beautiful, amazing ways through our failings, through the falling. And here, Richard's pointing out that there can be so much beautiful growth that can happen in the falling, in the failure, and that actually we grow much more spiritually. We become better people more when we've done it wrong and we've realized we've done it wrong. And when we've made, and from those experiences, we've actually grown from them, hopefully. And Richard will get into this later on, that you can do it wrong and then become bitter, angry, and actually have no sort of spiritual growth, right? So Richard's not talking about that. He's talking about those situations where you have gone through something super hard. And obviously during those situations, you don't know why kind of you have been dealt this card, why you are the one that has to go through this really traumatic, horrible event. But then, like when you come out on the other side of it, like the growth that can come from it, the empathy that can come from it, the passion, the energy, the love, the compassion, like all of that kind of, it can come up. And then your kind of view of life, your lens, that perspective that you have on others, I would hope, like from those experiences, that just love just kind of comes up out of you, comes out of me. Like that's the hope. So don't, I think the first time I read it, that line about we grow spiritually much more by doing it wrong than by doing it right. Obviously, you could take it the wrong way, but I think what Richard is really getting at is that, man, just think about how much growth can happen from the falling, and that's really what Richard's saying. And yeah, it is totally counterintuitive, right? No one wants to go through failure. No one wants to go through falling. But this is part of life, right? This is part of the seasons that we go through. We are going to go through hard times. And by the way, when we talk about falling and failure, this can be personal failings, but this can also be things that have happened to us or things that we experience. Like those are crucial moments in our life where growth can happen. And I'm saying can because, right, like we can choose to grow from it and learn from it. And it could be something that we grow from spiritually or become better people, have better understanding, better empathy. Like that can happen. But also, unfortunately, the other side can happen where we go into a place of anger, hatred, bitterness, and those things can all be justified, right? We can all be just in feeling those things. But hopefully over time, we can use those different fallings, those different events to help us become better people. I think in the sense of like having more empathy, having more love for others who may have also gone through similar things. So sorry for expanding there, but that's just my thought on that paragraph. It speaks to me. Okay, let's continue on. If there is such a thing as human perfection, it seems to emerge precisely from how we handle the imperfection that is everywhere, especially our own, period. Okay, another one of those lines I had to underline. Like, think about that one. If there's such a thing as human perfection, it seems to emerge on how we handle the imperfection. Like that is, that's one of those things I had to underline and star because it's such a interesting perspective on failure, on our imperfections, about how we emerge from it. Again, this is this idea, right, of like, how are we emerging from our own personal failings, from these fallings, from these periods that we're not proud of ourselves. We're not really proud of how we handled something or something that we've done that we're ashamed of. And Richard's saying like, hey, you know what? We're like kind of spiritual growth, and if we're to talk anything about what perfection and what goodness is, he's saying it's how we actually emerge and handle those failings. Like that. That's a good question to be thinking about. Like, how are we emerging from these different traumatic events in our life that have made us feel sad? That's something I need to think more about. Like, how am I emerging from those various situations? Richard goes on, he says, what a clever place for God to hide holiness, so that only the humble and earnest will find it. A perfect person ends up being one who can consciously forgive and include imperfection, rather than one who thinks he or she is totally above and beyond imperfection. Again, that's one of those lines I had to underline too. A perfect person ends up being one who can consciously forgive and include imperfection, rather than thinking that you're totally above this. It's that humility. It's that inclusive mindset of taking it all in, accepting it, forgiving those people, forgiving ourselves for those things that we have done, and just including it. It's a very deep thought here, and I think this is one of those things that, and one of the beautiful things about this book is that it speaks to me on so many different levels, and I just keep underlining things and things like statements like that where I have to go back to it, think about it. And by the way, like, the idea here is that we are just learning along with Richard. Like, Richard's teaching us. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything he's saying. But I think the questions and the thoughts here are definitely worth spending time thinking about, chewing on. And this is why I love this book so much. So many lines like that. Okay, let's keep going. I would say that the demand for the perfect is the greatest enemy of the good. Perfection is a mathematical or divine concept. Goodness is a beautiful human concept. That includes us all. By denying their pain, avoiding the necessary falling, many have kept themselves from their own spiritual depths, and therefore have been kept from their own spiritual heights. First half of religion is almost always about various types of purity codes or thou shall nots to keep us up, clear, clean, and together like good boy and girl scouts. A certain kind of purity and self-discipline is also behovely, at least for a while in the first half of life, as the Jewish Torah brilliantly presents. Period. So this is that part where we're just getting into kind of the introspection, right? The self-awareness that you've gone through something tragic. And again, the more traumatic, the more it has hurt you. Sometimes this is where we deny. We don't want to think about those things. I mean, who wants to think about our failings, our personal failings, or those things that we've gone through that are really, really hard to understand? Richard's saying by denying the pain, avoiding the necessary falling, may have kept us from our spiritual depths. I mean, and sometimes it just takes time. Like, right? Like, you go through something you're ashamed of, or you just are dealt a hand that you don't deserve, and it's a very painful experience, whatever that thing is, whatever that falling is, whatever that means to you. that difficult moment in life that you just rather not think about, right? And this is where therapy is super valuable for us, right? Where it forces us to sit down, like literally sit down with somebody and to like talk through those difficult seasons, those difficult things that we've gone through, those difficult failings that we've had. Richard says, by avoiding it, by avoiding those discussions, by not processing through those things, we can keep ourselves from our own spiritual depth. And I just think that for me, this is very true. Like, I know how painful it is to have to relive those experiences, to talk out loud about those things. It's very, very hard. And especially the first time, and then the second time, and the third time, right? Over time, with proper therapy, those experiences can become part of our story, and we can talk about how we've emerged and sometimes some of the beautiful things we've learned about ourselves or how we've changed in a great way. But the problem is, that Richard is addressing here, is like when we don't ever go there, we don't ever process through, we just put it away. And that's, putting it away is the easiest thing to do. It feels like the best thing, because who wants to reopen a wound, right? I just hurt my leg, and it's like I had to go to the doctor and have this piece of wood pulled out because I was mountain biking, anyways. But it's really painful, and I just wanted to heal. I wanted to just heal up so I can not have to think about it anymore. But like emotional trauma is much, much different. Like, you just don't want to reopen that bandage. Like, just let's forget it. Let's just move on. And that's the easiest way to handle it. And also sometimes initially the least painful way of handling it, right? But what Richard's saying here is that by denying the pain, by not processing through it, man, we're really missing out on something. And I think this is where therapy is super valuable. And also the other thing that I liked about what Richard said here is that he talks about what he calls first half of life religion, which is all about these purity codes, the thou shall nots, and again, nothing wrong with those purity codes. Like, those are all things that help us to, how to be productive, good members of society. Those are all essential. The trouble is where we begin to think that we are now good people, great people, because we have kept those codes. Like, that's where ego comes in. And sometimes because we've kept those codes, we somehow deserve a better life. And at least that's the way I felt growing up. So it can get us into trouble. Obviously, nothing wrong with those codes, those laws. Those are all things that are important for all of us to be good people, to be loving people. I mean, that's really the goal here, right? Jesus summarized the Ten Commandments by saying, the goal, the task within the task is really, how do we love God and how do we love others? Like, at the core of all those commandments was all about, how do we love God better and how do we love others better? I'm probably describing this wrong. Totally messing this up. This is the fun part of doing a recording, is you can kind of hear me trying to struggle. How do I explain this? I guess the idea is that, just because we follow these laws, we're now good people. And this is the message that Jesus had when he was here. Because where did he go? He was always with people who were kind of the outcasts of society. Like, he would go and spend time with those who were I guess, the struggling members. He did not really spend time with the Pharisees, the spiritual leaders. In fact, when you read the New Testament, you read the gospel accounts, like Jesus is always kind of, if anybody he's fighting with, it's the religious leaders. It's those who think they're above, those who think they've kept the law, right? When you read any criticism from Jesus, it's typically from those who think that they are holier than thou, those who have kept the law, right? Who are what Richard here is saying, like they're in that first half of life religion. Like, oh, but if I do these things, if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm now a better person. And where did Jesus spend his time? His time was spent actually being critical of those who thought that they were somehow people that were perfect and have kept the law. Instead, Jesus spent his time with those who were, what we would say, I guess, the humble, those who were who had fallen, those who were sick, and I mean this in a spiritual sense. And sometimes these were people who the religious leaders would say were deeply sinful, and that's where Jesus, as a spiritual healer, spent his time. And anyways, a lot more could be said about that. I'm going to mess it up any further, so I'm not going to continue. I'm just going to stop there, and then let's keep going back with Richard's book. The human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to falling or changing or dying. The ego is that part of you that loves the status quo, even when it's not working. It attaches to past and present and fears and future. When you're in the first half of life, you cannot see any kind of falling, failing, or dying as even possible, much less as necessary or good. Period. Right? Totally. That totally resonates with me. Oh my gosh. The thought that you can grow and become better through the failing, like the thought of that, never entered my mind earlier in life. Maybe it did for you, but I never really thought about it, and never even occurred to me that was really, or maybe, I don't know. I guess I just never really thought about it, that through failure, through trauma, that good can come from it. I guess like you're kind of taught that, at least for me, I was taught that in Sunday school, that good can come from the bad kind of thing. But, and you can kind of see it in certain situations, but not really the personal failings, not really the really horrific traumatic events. Like, no way. It doesn't make any sense. Who would talk like that? That doesn't, it just sounds heartless, and I don't know. But anyways, that resonates with me. Richard goes on, he says, those who have never gone up, like the poor and the marginalized, may actually have a spiritual head start, according to Jesus. But normally, we need a few good successes to give us some ego structure and self-confidence to get us going. God mercifully hides thoughts of dying from the young, but unfortunately, we then hide it from ourselves till later years finally force it into our consciousness. Ernest Becker said some years ago that it is not love, but the denial of death that might well make the world go round. What if he's right? Some have called this principle of going down to go up a spirituality of imperfection, or the way of the wound, period. I think this is like a really interesting way of putting it, this falling upward idea, the title of this book. Also calling it like the way of the wound. Like that's a interesting way of putting it too, right? Like thinking about like how we rise from these failings. Like that is kind of the way. Like how we emerge, it's the way of the wound. And, as we'll get into it in this book, like hopefully we emerge with that growth mindset. Anyways, I just like that the spirituality of imperfection, the way of the wound, the falling upward, right? Those are all really interesting ways of putting it. Okay, let's continue. St. Paul taught this unwelcome message with his enigmatic, "It is when I am weak that I am strong," 2 Corinthians 12:10. Of course, in saying that, he was merely building on what he called the folly of the crucifixion of Jesus, a tragic and absurd dying that became resurrection itself. Like skaters, we move forward by actually moving from side to side. I found this phenomenon to be the core and central in my research on male initiation, and now we are finding it mirrored rather clearly in the whole universe, and especially in physics and biology, which is one huge pattern of entropy, constant loss and renewal, death, transformation, the changing of forms and forces. Some even see this in terms of chaos theory. The exceptions are the only rule, and then they create new rules. Scary, isn't it? Okay, I gotta stop there. I like that line about, like skaters, we move forward by actually moving from side to side. Like, that's a really interesting metaphor. Again, like, we're moving forward by not trying to move forward, right? Like, we're actually growing and moving forward spiritually by these like moments where we think we're going sideways, or we're even going backwards, but for some reason that's propelling us spiritually, or whatever you want to call that personal growth, to become a better person, more enlightened person, like whatever you want to call that. For me, I'll call it spiritual growth, a better understanding of myself, and also within that, like, more love. And I guess whenever I'm using those words of spiritual growth, I think what I'm meaning by that is a better understanding of myself, and more empathy, more compassion, more love for others, and also myself. But I think, from Jesus' message about loving others, like, spiritual growth means that, man, my love for others, my compassion, my empathy for others should be growing from these experiences. And anyways, I like that idea of like skaters, we move forward actually from side to side. Okay, let's continue on. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. He says, the language of the first half of life and the language of the second half of life are almost two different vocabularies, known only to those who have been in both of them. The advantage of those on the further journey, or the second half, is that they can still remember and respect the first language and task. They have transcended, but also included all that went before. In fact, if you cannot include and integrate the wisdom of the first half of life, I doubt it if you have moved to the second. Never throw out the baby with the bathwater. People who know how to creatively break the rules also know why the rules were there in the first place. They are not mere iconoclasts or rebels. I like how Richard talks about how first half of life and second half of life are almost like two different languages. Like, not languages, vocabularies. Like, you basically, I guess, have an expanded view of certain things. If you think about vocabulary, knowing more words, more ways of explaining things, a deeper understanding. And that means sometimes, how like when you look in the dictionary and you look up a word, and then sometimes there's 3, 4, 5, sometimes 6 different definitions for that word. And sometimes there's that one word where like one of the definitions is like new to you. It's like, what? That actually means that too? I didn't know that. I think that's the way it is with like what Richard's saying about the second half of life, where you look back on certain experiences, certain things you've learned, certain things you've gone through. And as you have processed through those things, all of a sudden you have like a deeper understanding of what has happened. And a lot of times for me anyways, it's happened through therapy or just really kind of, journaling it, talking it, at least for me, talking it out. Like you can kind of start to see things in those events. But I do like the metaphor of vocabulary, that kind of these different things are like words. And the more we kind of think through them, it is almost like an expanded vocabulary. You just seeing things in a different light. Not to say that the original meanings aren't still there. You still appreciate the original way that you view it as being whatever it was for you. But there's just an expansion, right? Richard says it's this. He says they have transcended, but also include what was before. So there's like an extension, like you understand that thing, that failing better, in a more deep way. But you also include like the I don't want to say the simpler initial thoughts on it, or the I don't want to call it that, but I guess you just appreciate all of it. You accept all those different perspectives, and you kind of treasure them all along the way, as you are having a better, deeper understanding of those things. I guess it's even like reading a book. Like as I'm going through this book, like the first time I read it, so many things go over my head, and still today it goes over my head. But because I've like underlined and spent some time thinking through some things, like there are certain parts of this book that really mean a lot more to me than they did earlier on. And so I guess that's kind of another way of putting it. I'm sorry if I'm totally messing this up. That's the fun part of like doing this recording. I'm just sitting here trying to process through the things that I'm reading again. Oh man. Okay, let's continue. Richard says, I've often thought that this is the symbolic meaning of Moses breaking the first tablets of the law, only to go back up the mountain and have them redone by Yahweh. Okay, let me read that again. Okay. I've often thought that this is the symbolic meaning of Moses breaking the first tablets of the law, only to go back up the mountain and have them redone by Yahweh. The second set of tablets emerge after a face-to-face encounter with God, which changes everything. Our first understanding of law must fail us and disappoint us. Only after breaking the first tablets of the law is Moses a real leader and prophet. Only afterwards does he see God's glory, and only afterwards does his face shine. It must just be the difference between the two halves of life. That's a really cool kind of way of thinking about it, that story of Moses breaking the tablets. It's an interesting understanding of it, right? It's after that failure, that actually breaking the tablets and then having to go back up the mountain and having that encounter with God. Like that's an interesting way of thinking about this falling upward. It was through that original failure that he then had this transcendent experience with God in the real sense. Let's continue on. Richard says, such discrimination between means and goals is almost the litmus test of whether you're moving in the right direction. And all the world religions at the mature levels will say the similar things. For some reason, religious people tend to confuse the means with the actual goal. In the beginning, you tend to think that God really cares about your exact posture, the exact day of the week for public prayer, the authorship and wordings of your prayers, and other such things. Once your life has become a constant communion, you know that all the techniques, the formulas, sacraments, and practices were just a dress rehearsal for the real thing, life itself, which can actually become a constant, intentional prayer. Your conscious and loving existence gives glory to God. All of this talk of the first and second half of life, of the languages of each, of falling down to go up, is not new. It has been embodied for centuries in mythic tales of men and women who have found themselves on the further journey. we will now take a closer look at one of the most famous, period. So a lot is there here. This is what I'm saying, like, talk about underlining and starring and highlighting. Like, there's so much gold here, and things that I have to like underline and like go back to, journal, think through, because there's so many little nuggets of wisdom, and some of these things like stand out to me right away. Like when he talks about how the means with the actual goal, and how we get so much like we get so caught up about the exact posture, the day of the week, right? The are we reading the right books? Are we reading the right prayers? Like whatever it is that we think is leading to our spiritual growth, sometimes we can get so caught up in these different tasks that we've lost sight of what the actual goal was, right? And Richard was saying, like, at the end of the day, if your spiritual goal is to improve your relationship with God, he says at the end of this, it's like you're realizing that it wasn't all these various different tasks that you've been trying to do. It's actually, at the end of the day, like just becoming a living vessel of communion, that you're just naturally becoming the church. Like you're not actually, like when that realization happens that you are the church, like you should be embodying that spiritual communion like all day long, all night long. Like you are, it was never about the task. It's about this constant communion with God. You know, if you're not a Christian, not religious, what I just said will just sound goofy to you. So totally understand that. But I think like, I think you get it, right? Like Richard's saying, like, it was never about all these different do X, Y, and Z, and then you're going to become a spiritually amazing person. No, in fact, like the whole point of all the different tasks was really to hopefully help you understand that your whole life should be this like constant communion, this constant love of God and love of others, and those different tasks was never what it was all about. Like, yes, they were good and proper for us to practice those things and to get us into that habit. But again, the goal here was that, no, this is actually just part of a realization that this is who we are. And these tasks were never the point. The point was, like, how are we drawing ourselves to God on a regular basis? And how are we going into communion on a regular basis? And can our whole life be a communion? Can it be a place where we are drawing and growing in love and compassion for God and for others? Okay, so at the end of the introduction, Richard kind of breaks up how the Odyssey helps us to see the first half of life and second half of life more clearly, and also includes the various fallings and tragedies that Odysseus goes through. And I totally recommend going through it. It's really, really enlightening, especially if you've ever like studied the Odyssey. He talks about things that I never saw in that book, and it's been years since I've read it. But it really does provide a good structure. And I thought it was really interesting that he chose the Odyssey as being like a really good myth to look back on how kind of life works. And so I totally recommend that you go through that. Richard then says, now put this powerful myth in the back of your mind as we dive into this exciting exploration of the further journey. It can operate as sort of a blueprint for what we want to say. Just remember this much consciously. The whole story is set in the matrix of seeking to find home and then to return there, and thus refining and defining what home really is. Home is both the beginning and the end. Home is not a sentimental concept at all, but an inner compass and a north star at the same time. It is a metaphor for the soul. And yes, my female readers, it is an old male story and reflects issues from that side of the gender divide, but it is true for you too in ways that you will discover. So I don't know about you, but this got me fired up. Like when I read this introduction and read the invitation to a further journey, which are the two sections that begin, like we haven't even started the first chapter. This is just the introduction. This is just leading us into, oh my gosh, like you read this, you're like, what is all this about first half of life, second half of life, falling upward? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean for me? Like all these like really fascinating concepts, right? We've just kind of like briefly talked about. This is just the introduction. Like talk about a teaser. And as you can tell, a lot of metaphor, a lot of spiritual language, a lot of lines and words that I have to underline and think about and process through and question. And I think that's another part of this book. And this is why this book is so powerful to me, because not only are those things where I have to like, oh, I got to think about that one. I got to really spend more time thinking about it. Or sometimes, I underline things and I have no idea what it means. And I'm like, I hope I can understand this better if I keep reading, right? And there's definitely a lot of sections in here that I'll go through that I don't understand it quite clearly. I need to spend more time processing through it. But I did write down some questions as we were going through it, and I wrote down just some questions that I want to think about after reading this introduction. And here's the questions I wrote down. What are some of the failings, some of the fallings, some of those traumatic things that we've gone through? What are they? Did they come to mind? Do any of them stand out to you? I know they stand out to me. There's some that are very, very clear to me, that are very painful. And the question is like, what have we learned from one of these experiences? So if you, in my mind, I can scroll through and see various things that I'm ashamed of, things that things that make me sad. And the question is, instead of dwelling on what actually happened, what have we learned from it? What have we learned from it? And that question, the answer to that question will evolve over time. For me anyways. I think that answer will continue to expand as we get older and as we see more meaning in those fallings. And hopefully we continue to learn from these fallings. So that's the first kind of question that I need to think more about, is to really just pick out a painful moment, a painful falling, a painful failure, and just kind of journal and process through it. I mean, that's why I go to therapy, is just for me to vocalize those things. But I think that any of us can just go through and just kind of begin to journal or talk about to ourselves that thing, or talk to a trusted friend about that thing that has hurt us, and talk about the things that we have grown from it, if possible. And the second one is, has this falling, has this failure led us to become an improved version of yourself, a more mature, spiritually grown, like whatever the wording is for you. The idea is like, has that thing led you to become a better version of yourself, a more compassionate person, a person with more empathy, more care, more understanding towards yourself, towards others? That's I guess those are the two things that I'm thinking about after reading this introduction. The other thing is that I don't know about you, but I'm excited. I'm excited to go through this again and to talk about out loud these two halves of life, what they mean to me right now. I'm super pumped. I'm super excited. So that was just the teaser. This is the introduction of Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, and we will go through this book together. And I'm just skipping through here to look through. So this book has 13 chapters, 13 gems that we'll go through, and we'll begin. The next episode of this podcast will be on chapter 1, which is called The Two Halves of Life, where Richard is going to break down for us in more detail what these different halves of life mean. We talked about them a little bit in this introduction. We had kind of a glimpse of what they are, and in the very first chapter of this book, called The Two Halves of Life, which we're going to get to next, Richard breaks down in more detail what these two halves of life look like, how we can better describe them, and so let's get to it. Next episode. Let's talk then. Take care.